All right, the second lecture for this holiday schedule is on the nervous system. And when we come back from Thanksgiving break, then we'll continue on with sensory biology, which is a very fascinating aspect of the biology of sharks and their relatives. Then Friday we'll have the last of the student presentations, and then we've only got 4 lectures after that. So to begin with, in terms of the nervous system, first of all, we'll look at the sensory capabilities of sharks and their relatives, which are well known, and one of the reasons why they've been so successful for as long as they have. And then we'll look at the various components of their nervous system before we get into their special senses, which is going to be the topics that we talk about Monday and part of Wednesday as well. Well, the sensory capabilities of sharks and the relatives is very well known, as I said. I've heard a number of times this idea that sharks can smell a drop of blood in a swimming pool. Well, I don't know what the concentrations of that blood is and how big the swimming pool is, but there's obviously some relation between the sensitivity of shark olfactory capabilities and the concentration of some amino acid or blood in water that's related to. Either way, sharks and skates and rays are all well known for their sensory capabilities. And as I said, it's one of the reasons why they've been around for 400 million years. They're very good at sensing their environment. They're very good at responding to those senses. They have a very high level of sensitivity, and they've got a number of different senses that they use. And in the end, we'll see that they integrate these all together in order to respond to different environmental stimuli related to prey capture, related to predator avoidance, related to finding mates, related to navigation, related to dealing with environmental characteristics of their habitat, all these different things. They have a lot of senses, and these senses are very highly tuned towards providing them with information that helps them survive. And we'll see also that there's a lot of similarities with bony fish. Sharks are fish, and bony fish are fish. But there's also some differences in their sensory capabilities and the type of senses that they even have. So that's something else to keep in mind while we're going through this topic. Well, first of all, let's look at the central nervous system. There's in vertebrates, not invertebrates, but in animals that are vertebrates, there's the central nervous system and there's the peripheral nervous system. And in terms of the central nervous system, there's a number of characteristics that are related to both the evolutionary history and the ecology of sharks and the relatives. The central nervous system, as you're probably familiar, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. It's in their head, and it spans down the center of the body. And away from the spinal cord come these different nerves that branch out and innervate the rest of the body in the peripheral nervous system. And there's different patterns of development in different types of sharks and skates and rays. You've got a number that have relatively small, simple brains. If you look in this figure here on the right, there's a shark that's got a relatively small brain and relatively simple brain. Then there's the gallimiorph sharks that are involved in a lot more sensory processing. They rely on their brain for a lot more sensory integration and basically interacting with their environment for survival. And then there's the batoids, which have a different evolutionary history from the sharks, which is one of the reasons why they're grouped into different categories. And of course, they also have a very different lifestyle. So if you look at the brain, beginning with the brain, it's obviously an important part of the central nervous system and explains a lot about the ability of an organism to survive in its habitat. So first we'll look at the brain, and then we'll look at patterns of the brain organization or brain size, which is basically encephalization. Then we'll look at the nerves that come off the brain, not very different in elasmobranchs than other vertebrates. And then the spinal cord as well, which is also similar, but there's some distinctive characteristics of the elasmobranch spinal cord compared to other vertebrates. Well, just as in other vertebrates, the brain of elasmobranchs is organized into 4 main different parts. Sometimes it's divided into 5 different parts, depending on how you divide up the brain. But it's basically anatomy. You have the brain laid out in a certain way, and it's got these different parts. In some considerations of this brain organization, there's only 3 parts of the brain. It just really depends on how you decided to divide these up. It's kind of an arbitrary division anyway. But there's the telencephalon, or the anterior part of the forebrain, which in sharks and skates and rays is large in most of the species, and it's related to olfaction. Smell is obviously a very important sense in elasmobranchs. Some people might argue it's the most important sense. You can smell things from a long ways away, much farther away than you can see things or use your electroreception or taste things. So this ability to smell, it's not surprising that they've got a well-developed olfactory portion of their brain. The diencephalon, just behind the anterior part of the brain. Then you've got these different parts that are of the brain that are receiving stimuli from different sensory organs, different sensory parts like the eyes and some of the other glands or parts of the brain that are regulatory. Then you've got the midbrain with the optic lobes, where there's lobes, visual sensory integration, where there's a lot of visual stimuli coming in. Vision is an important sense for sharks, skates, and rays. For quite a while, it was thought that they couldn't see very well and that they relied on their nose, and this is where this idea of them being swimming noses came from, and this fascination with how acute their ability to smell was, that they could sense tiny little concentrations of some substance that they were attracted to, for instance, an amino acid. But vision is an important component of the sensory system of sharks, skates, and rays. Not so much in some species, but in other species, it's really important, and they're really visual predators. And then you've got the hindbrain, where there's a sensory system from the lateral line and electroreception, ampulla, and the cerebrum as well. And so we'll see in certain vertebrates, that's a really important part of the brain, and it's a big part of the brain. So there's basically different parts of the brain that are related to sensory biology. There's a couple of different parts, like the olfactory bulbs, the optic lobes, but you could divide the brain up in terms of portions that are related to sensing the environment, sensory biology of the animals. And we'll see that's a big part of the brain of sharks and their relatives. There's also part of the brain that's related to coordinated movement, particularly the cerebellum. Not the cerebrum, but the cerebellum. And you'll find in some animals where coordination of movement, doing things very quickly, and muscle memory, muscle coordination, and being able to coordinate movements is very important, such as birds. And you find that that part of the brain of birds is well developed and large compared to a lot of other vertebrates. And then, of course, you've got the cerebrum, the part of the brain that's associated with thought and intelligence and processing information other than sensory memory, those kind of things. So there's different parts of the brain. that are related to different functions and associated with different levels of ability for different things, whether it's sensory biology or movement or thought. And then there's these ventricles. There's a system of fluid, that canals basically that move through the brain, that interconnect it, that bathe the brain in cerebrospinal fluid. Well, if you look at a figure of the brain of different animals, there's a horse and an alligator and a shark. You can see these different parts. There's a anterior forebrain, the posterior forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And here's 3 different types of animals that obviously sense their environment in different ways, respond to their environment in different ways, basically rely on their brain to do different things. And the figure on the right, there's a typical shark brain or elasma brain with these big olfactory bulbs on the front. People compare this a lot of times with the uterus of females, a similar look where there's 2 ovaries with oviducts, and it's a similar type of design. But olfaction, obviously very important in terms of the ability of sharks, skates, and rays to survive. Well, people often attribute intelligence, or they correlate intelligence with the size of a brain. And in some cases, that's true. As I said, there's different parts of the brain that are large for different reasons. So if you just look at how big a brain is, then certainly there's some correlation with intelligence. If you've got a big brain, then the odds are that you're going to be intelligent. If you've got a little walnut brain, then you're probably not going to be doing that much thinking and be that intelligent. However, it's not just brain size that determines the intelligence of an organism. In fact, if you look at the relative brain size as a percentage of body weight, then sometimes that's more useful. And if you look at what parts of the brain are big, whether it's the cerebellum or the cerebrum or the sensory apparatus, sensory parts of the brain, then it also gives you an idea of what they're actually using their brains for. So if you look at elasma brain, sharks, skates, and rays, you'll see, as we're going through these slides, that they actually have a relatively large brain, which is contrary to the idea that they're not big thinkers. They're not very good learners of memory, and they're not doing a lot of neuroprocessing that you associate with higher vertebrates like mammals, for instance, and us, and birds to a certain degree. But they have large brains, primarily related to their sensory biology. So if you look at these different types of sharks, skates, and rays, the squalomorphs and the squatinomorphs, you recognize those as dogfish and angel sharks, and then some of the horn sharks and basking shark, nurse shark, those kind, and some batoids, relatively primitive batoids like the skates, then they tend to have small brains. They're not doing that much with their brains, and part of the brain may be related to smell and other sensory biology, but they're not necessarily using their brain for a lot of other functions. Then you've got some other galeomorphs, like the lamnid sharks and the carcharinids and the hammerheads, and some of the, the pretty active batoids have relatively large brains. So if you look at their brain size and the organization of their brain, what I mean by that is which parts of the brain are big and which parts of the brain are well developed and which parts aren't, then there's a couple of trends that you see. Brain size and brain organization, which parts of the brain are large and which parts are small, is related to a couple of things. It's related to phylogeny, or it's related to their evolutionary history, but it's also related to ecology. And what we'll see is if you've got these pelagic species, you've got species that are basically like birds, except they're not flying around in the air, they're swimming around in the open water. They tend to have larger brains than benthic species that are very bottom oriented. And this will make sense as we go through this. What are you using your brain for? If you're processing a lot of sensory information to move and to move through the coral reef and to move in the open ocean and to sense where you are and navigate and those kind of things, and obviously you need a bigger brain than if you're just laying on the bottom most of the time. And like other vertebrates, intelligence is related to brain size, but primarily in terms of the cerebrum. More convoluted and larger the cerebrum is, that tends to be associated with more intelligent animals like mammals and humans. But there's also large brains that aren't related to thought and decision making and those kind of those kind of factors, but related to sensory systems. That's what we're going to see more prominent in sharks and the relatives. Well, as I said, if you look at the brains of sharks, if you compare them to mammals and birds, they're not going to have as big of brains. They're not going to have as well-developed brains, especially in the cerebrum or the cerebellum, compared to mammals and compared to birds. But if you compare the brain size of sharks and skates and rays with other vertebrates, such as reptiles and amphibians and a lot of other species of fish, then they actually have relatively large brains. Now, there's this notion of bird brains. If you've ever been called bird brain, it's not a complimentary thing, because birds are supposed to have small brains and they're not supposed to be particularly smart. But if you express the size of a bird brain in proportion to the size of the body, they actually have relatively large brains. But if you look at the pattern of the brain organization, you see that it's the cerebellum part of the brain that tends to be larger in birds, which is related to coordinated movement. If you're a bird and you're flying very quickly and you're flying through the trees and you have to maneuver around very quickly and make decisions very quickly, and your eyes are working and processing sensory information in order for you to fly really quickly through the trees but not run into any branches and be able to land and be able to chase insects and get away from predators, those kind of things. And it makes sense that the part of the brain that's very big in birds is the cerebellum, not the cerebrum. And it's a similar thing in sharks, skates, and rays, where it's not the cerebrum that's big and resulting in them having a relatively large brain, but it tends to be the sensory lobes, the olfactory lobes, and the occipital lobes, or the lobes that are related to vision. The cerebrum, which is usually associated with intelligence, how big the cerebrum is, how convoluted the cerebrum is generally a good indicator of how intelligent an animal is. That tends to not be very big in birds or in elasmobranchs. Well, here's a figure that shows what I was just talking about. There's teleosts. You see how small their brains are. They don't have very big brains. There's birds, which have relatively big brains and overlap quite a bit with mammals. And then there's elasmobranchs that overlap quite a bit with birds and mammals. Now, obviously, mammals, especially when you get up into primates, have very large brains, and they're capable of making a lot of different uses of their large brain, primarily their cerebrum. They can remember things, they make decisions, they're very intelligent. But look at where elasmobranchs are, right in the middle in terms of their brain size. And so, again, there was this notion, oh, birds, your bird brain, they've got little brains. Actually, birds have relatively large brains. A lot of it associated with movement, coordinated movement. Elasmobranchs have relatively large brains. And so you might think, oh, maybe they're not as dumb as everybody thought they were. Well, a lot of the elasmobranch brain, as I said, is related to sensory biology. And then look who's down there on the bottom with not very big brains. Of course, it's the bony fish, which a lot of people consider to be much more highly evolved than elasmobranch. But who's got the tiny little brain? It's bony fish for the most part. Well, let's look at this notion of encephalization. By encephalization, I mean the relative brain size and the organization of that brain. So if we look at this time 5 different areas of the brain, and not just 4, but if you look at the development of these 5 different regions of the brain that are associated with different functions, then starting out looking at different batoid species, skates and rays, and looking at the cerebellum in particular, then and using the different species as each species as a data point, comparing the phylogeny, how closely related these are phylogenetically, and what their brain organization is like, then it's pretty clear that there's the organization of brain, how big these different parts of the brain are, those 5 different parts. There's a clear association between the phylogeny, or how closely related these different species were, and what the brain was organized like, or the pattern of organization of the brain. They also looked at the relative size of these different parts of the brain and the size of the brain in general with the type of habitat that these batoids occupied. Are they very benthically oriented, and their lifestyle as well? Now, batoids, of course, they're, for the most part, a lot of skates and rays are going to be pretty sedentary, pretty benthically oriented. So it may not be the best comparison. It may not offer you the widest range of lifestyles, but there's certainly some variety in how benthic and sedentary different species of batoids are. So one of the things that they found was that there was a strong correlation with phylogeny. If you look at these different groups, different traits, obviously they have different traits because they have different genes, and closely related organisms have similar genes. There's a lot of overlap in terms of their DNA and the genes that they have. So there's a lot of words up here. You can look at things that are kind of have a slow lifestyle, like the skates and the torpedo rays. Then they have relatively small brains with a number of different parts of the brains that are relatively small as well. If you look at other groups, such as the Myliobatiformes, or the myliobatids, like the devil rays and the eagle rays and the manta rays, those kind that are up in the water column, they're swimming around, they're not just laying on the bottom with a sedentary lifestyle, then those tend to have larger brains, larger cerebellums especially, and they're kind of bird-like in a way. So there's definitely a relationship between pattern of encephalization, which parts of the brain are large, and the size of the brain as a whole, and phylogeny. There's also a correlation between the lifestyle, or the ecology of species, and the pattern of encephalization, how big the brain is and what parts of the brain are well developed. So if you live in a complex environment, a complex habitat where you've got to swim around, it's basically like a bird flying through the trees, where if you make a wrong move and boom, you run into a branch, that's not a good thing. If you're moving around in this complex 3-dimensional environment such as a coral reef, that's a whole different set of circumstances and requirements for your sensory biology and your nervous system than if you're laying on the bottom in some kind of a mud very unidimensional type of environment where it's not very complex, and it doesn't take a well-developed nervous system to be able to survive in that type of habitat. So if you look at habitat and lifestyle, then there's a correlation with the pattern of brain development in these batoids. And however, if you look at both the phylogeny and the ecology, then there's a lot of species that are closely related that have similar type of ecological roles. There's a bunch of them that are closely related that lay on the bottom, basically, and there's a bunch of them that are closely related that inhabit these fairly complex three-dimensional environments. So it's hard to tease out the difference between what's responsible for these patterns in their brain. Is it just phylogeny and the genes that they have, or is it really related to their habitat and ecology? Well, when people have looked at more species, not just these batoids, but other species of sharks and skates and rays, and seeing what their brain development was like and the brain size was like in relation to their ecology, that there's a real close relationship between ecology and the development of their brain. So that there's certainly maybe some component of this pattern of their brain size and which parts of the brain are well developed in terms of being closely related to other species, that it's a phylogenetic characteristic. But there's exceptions to that, and there's a number of species where if you look at two closely related species, one that's got a certain type of behavior, habitat, lifestyle that's not sedentary, compare that with one that is, then there's a difference in their encephalization. And so that certainly there's no getting around the fact that similar species have similar genes. So you're bound to find some phylogenetic similarities in terms of their brain size and brain development. However, ecology seems to play a big role in this, and it depends on what you do, what your lifestyle is. If you're needing to process information quickly, if you're needing to rely on different parts of your brain in order to survive in a more complex habitat, then it makes perfect sense that that part of your brain is going to be better developed, it's going to be bigger, and in fact your whole brain may be larger than even a close relative that has a very different lifestyle. Well, this figure shows the degree of encephalization, or how big a brain is, basically, for a number of different elasmobranchs. And if you look here at the benthic sharks and benthic rays, you see they don't have very big brains. And if you look at some that are kind of benthic, or maybe they're not laying on the bottom, but they're certainly bottom oriented, then you've got relatively small brains. If you look at some that are a little more active of these rays, then they tend to have bigger brains. And if you look at some of the pelagic ones, pelagic sharks, they tend to have a little bigger brains, maybe a wider range of brains. But if you go over to the right, keep going to the right, and you get into these type of elasmobranchs, both sharks and rays that are inhabiting these complex environments like coral reefs, where they're up in the water column, they're off at the bottom, and they're involved in all these different types of decisions that they have to make, whether it's instinctive or whether they're actually making some type of decision, then you see their brains get relatively larger. And you get to something like the Carcharodontis amblyrhynchus, which is a gray reef shark that's in a reef, in this very complex three-dimensional habitat. They've got relatively large brains. So that's the idea, that brain size and brain development in different parts of the brain is related to their ecology, not just their phylogeny. Well, in terms of cranial nerves, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but these are vertebrates. And like other vertebrates, there's these 12 cranial nerves. if you have ever had human anatomy, then or human physiology, or now it's one course, human anatomy and physiology, then this is something everybody's got to memorize in these courses like that. And there's the mnemonic devices for being able to remember these 12 cranial nerves that come out of the brain, or the brain stem, the lower part of the brain, not the spinal cord, but they come out of the brain, and they go to different parts. They go to the eyes, they go to for sensory biology for the most part that's in the head. Cranial nerve. So they're no different than other vertebrates. Well, in terms of the spinal cord is similar to what you find in other vertebrates as well. Maybe not as well developed in sharks, skates, and rays as in mammals, birds. But if you look at the spinal cord, then it comes out of the brain, it attaches to the brain, and extends the length of the body all the way to the end of their tail. There's gray matter and there's white matter. Just like you can look at the spinal cord, or the brain for that part, of the central nervous system of other vertebrates, white matter and gray matter. And then as the spinal cord is moving along the body, there's spines, there's nerves that radiate out away from the spinal cord, just like you find in other vertebrates. And it's segmented, so there's different segments of the body, especially in terms of musculature, that are innervated by these main nerves that come off of the spinal cord. So it's not much different than you find in a lot of different vertebrates, especially fish-like vertebrates. Now, when you get to things with arms and limbs and more complex body arrangements, then it's going to be more than just a trunk with limbs coming off of it. There's a lot more complexity in terms of innervating these different body parts. But for the most part, similar to other vertebrates. And one of the interesting things about the spinal cord of sharks, skates, and rays is that if you cut off the head of a shark, or if you sever the spinal cord, there's still this, it's not really a reflex, but it's this automated contraction of the muscle and the firing of the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord that keep a shark swimming. So the nerves are innervating the muscles that are saying, okay, move your tail this way, move your tail that way. This side of your body muscles contract, this side of the body muscles contract. And so you can have a shark where you've severed the spinal cord. There doesn't have to be a stimulus from the brain to the spinal cord in order to get those muscles contract and have the shark swim back and forth, or move its tail back and forth. Okay, that's about 30 minutes. So this is going to be the first part of this lecture, and then there'll be another 20 minutes.